Join me now as we go back in time. Do so with your own experiences, but for me, as I go back in time, I'm thinking of the year 1975, because it was then that I first learned about the War of 1812 and the Battle of New Orleans. At this point, I was 6 years old. Now I would invite you to think back to the first time that you learned about this conflict and about this battle. And maybe your experience mirrors mine, and that way back in 1975, when I was first taught about the Battle of New Orleans, it was presented to me in a way that, upon further reflection, is a little bit flawed, a little less than ideal, and it contained and included one very important overriding point, and that is that it was presented to me as the last battle of the War of 1812. Is that how it was presented to you? Yeah. That's how we were all sold this bill of goods, wasn't it? And I think that it actually is something that continues to this day, because I remember seeing a recent video presentation, I watched it on YouTube last night, that was as recent as the bicentennial, when they should have known better, but they still referred to it as the last battle of the War of 1812. And what's about to happen now is you are about to have your minds blown when our next speaker discusses how that conflict came to an end. Harold Youmans retired from the United States Army after 28 years. He holds the JD degree. Although he didn't practice law, he did serve directly as a magistrate. So he went directly from soldier to judge. Kind of an interesting career in the law, don't you think? And he's now going to talk to us about events that happened after what happened about a mile that way 201 years ago tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Harold Youmans.
But yes, my lecture is on post-war hostilities, and I've gone through several iterations of this, and arguing with brain surgeons, large and small, about what the definition of a battle is. And when do wars end? These are not strictly academic discussions. What I found out in my research is that the definition of battle that was published in 1810 is very different than the definition of battle that was existent during the time your history professor was going to get his PhD. We have changed the definition of battle. We have changed the definition of when wars end, and we have really, perhaps, lost focus on the meaning of the Treaty of Ghent and the meaning of the definition and the use of ratification. What's important for our discussion today, if you take a legal perspective, is who knew what, and when did he know it? I think if you're of an age to remember the Watergate discussions several decades ago, what did he know, and when did he know it? Think about Lambert as we go through this. Okay, we're going to look at exactly when the war ended. You see I have some dates up here, 17th of February. That's the day that the United States Congress ratified the motion to ratify the treaty. And if we read what the treaty said, we'll find out that it really went into effect differently in different parts of the world. Those days you see up there actually divided the world up into sections based on the seas and the maneuver and how long it took for a ship to get from Liverpool, England, to the Sunda Strait in what is today Indonesia. And we see that the war was supposed to end some 30 or 60 or 90 or 120 days out. So let's look at some of the events that did take place in that time. Professor Chapman started talking very briefly about the Mississippi River and, of course, Fort St. Philip. Fort St. Philip sits downriver from us. We had, at the time, elements of the 7th U.S. Infantry and some artillery down at Fort St. Philip. It was really a very large fort as far as the U.S. was concerned. It had some large caliber cannon, large number of mortars, a fairly robust garrison. British command came upriver after the war, after the battle. Actually, they started coming up the river about the 8th of January, and they came up with about 6 ships, including 2 bomb vessels. If you knew what a bomb vessel was, you know that they could sit off a fairly long range, and they could lob some very large shells. Think about that picture at Fort McHenry. The same kind of bomb vessels that they had in the Chesapeake Bay are the kinds of bomb vessels that the British had at the time. The pictures on the side, the bottom one is a depiction of Walter Overton. He was in command at the Battle of Fort St. Philip, and of course the picture up front is a period view. Fort St. Philip was a typical star fort. You see that kind of drawing. And of course, I'm doing some work now on some fortification studies in New York. The more they dig around New York, the more of these kinds of forts they see at various locations. But at Fort St. Philip, it lasted about 10 days. The last remaining U.S. gunboat on the Mississippi went down to help them. There was a bombardment. The bottom photo you see here is of a 32-pound gun. It was not taken at Fort St. Philip, but that shows you what the British saw. And they saw that gun. It was apparently hit during that 10-day period a total of 5 times. It was put out of action and then rebuilt and remounted by the Americans. The casualties here were very light, but that bombardment took place over, like I said, about 10 days, about the time that Lambert was withdrawing the land troops. The naval forces in the bay started to go back down. But clearly, the Battle of Fort St. Philip on the 18th of January is one of the candidates for what was the last battle of the War of 1812. Let's shift for a minute back up to Maryland. We know that in 1813, 1814, a lot of British activity. The Tonnant was up in this area. The USS Constellation was blockaded at Norfolk. A couple of other ships were blockaded at Annapolis. The Chesapeake was really a British lake. They had some land installations at St. George Island and on St. James Island. And when Cochrane moved his forces south to come into New Orleans, he left 1 frigate and a couple of sloops up in Maryland. But as late as the 24th of February, we see some actions going on in this particular area. Many of us can probably remember that there was something called the Battle of the Ice Mound. The story here about February 7th, it's cold in Maryland on February 7th. The ice formed up around a ship that had gone ashore to get some water or foodstuffs or whatever, and it got trapped in the ice. The Maryland militia said, aha, finally our chance. And they attacked this little British expedition, captured them all, captured their weapons, captured their men, captured their cook, their women. They captured everybody. And if you ever wandered someplace out in Maryland, you'll find this sign that says the Battle of the Ice Mound. The problem is that if you read that sign, you will find out that almost everything on it is wrong. That's okay. You see, I can say that here because I don't think there's very many members of the Maryland Historical Society here. But when you get up to Maryland, you can't say it's wrong. You have to say there may be a better way to say it. I can tell you a long story about going up to Burlington, Vermont on one of my first post-retirement lectures up in Vermont, and I used the word smuggling and Vermont in the same paragraph. Wrong. There was no smuggling in Vermont, and don't you forget it. So we got to figure out what really happened up there in February of 1815. The British finally didn't leave. They finally left to Chesapeake Bay in March. So we see, if we think about what the last battle is, do the militia count? Now, if you got a regular officer in the 7th Infantry or a regular officer in the 44th Infantry, and he is engaged with a regular officer who has been given his commission by the Prince Regent in England, well, that might be a battle. But you know, these militia, good Lord, you know, they're even subhuman. They don't even deserve any mention. Is a militia battle a battle? And of course, the academicians will go crazy over that because they don't know whether it is or isn't. But let's see that the Maryland militia was fighting in their homes, in their home counties, well into March of 1815. Is that the last battle of the war? And of course, here's the devil and the devil's son. If you know who these two guys are, one is Cochrane, and Dr. Chapman certainly gave part of the quote from Wellington. Wellington blamed Cochrane for the death of Pakenham. He said so at the eulogy given at St. Paul's Church over in London. Cochrane was the son of one of the peers in England, and the famous quote, after his brother has been charged with conspiracy, theft, and treason, the famous quote about the Cochrane family is, "You can't trust any of them. They're all crooked." Well, maybe they were, maybe they weren't, but at the time, he was a vice admiral, and his lead chase dog there was Admiral Cockburn. Cockburn, you remember, he burned Coburn. Coburn burned the White House, right? Tried to take Baltimore. He was really given this job of going down to Georgia and create a diversion so that Cochrane can do what he needed to do in New Orleans. He was also supposed to participate in economic disruption. This was supposed to kick off in November. His ship was having a difficult problem, went off to Bermuda, much better climate in Bermuda than there is in the northern part of the United States. And it wasn't until mid-January that Coburn shows up off the Georgia coast. If you look at some dates, the 24th of February is the last time that he sent armed British sailors and Marines into, if you look at the bottom picture over there, that's what the St. Mary's River looks like on the Georgia-Florida border. And the upper picture is the present view of what the plantation that they occupied on Cumberland Island looks like. That's the Dungeness plantation. But there was a battle at Fort Peter. Members of the 43rd U.S. Infantry was engaged against the Royal Marines and the 2nd West Indies Regiment. Gunboat 168 was carrying dispatches out to the fleet, and nobody in the British fleet wanted to know anything about any dispatches, so they attacked Gunboat 168 in early February. And the legal issue here becomes whether or not what was going on in South Georgia was really legitimate or not. Because what was happening at the time, it turns out, and the little handout that I gave you showed that the newspapers originally gave news of the treaty as early as the 28th of December, 1814. Those newspapers were then found their way onto ships that were sailing out of Portsmouth, out of Bristol, out of the estuary in London on the Thames. And a great many people wandering the North Atlantic knew that the treaty had been signed. Was it a proper action of the British government to try to free the slaves in order to create an economic disruption? Today we say, of course it was. But if you go back and you look at what the rules and the law was in 1815, these kinds of actions that the British Army undertook in the United States were litigated well into the 1850s. Morally, freeing the slaves is probably what we ought to have done, and we should have done it probably 50 years earlier than we did it. But if we think about it, was it legal at the time the British did it? And so that's another post-war issue that needs more examination. Like I said, the last action in Georgia was the 24th of February. Coburn knew of the treaty. Cochrane knew of the treaty. These people knew there was a treaty as early as February. We heard about Fort Bower. I'm not going to go very much into it. The fellow on the bottom over there is Major Lawrence. He had had a long career on the frontier. Jackson just excoriated him for giving up the fort. Others had a better view. He stayed in the Army, served in the Army until 1828, retired as a colonel, and he was not materially damaged by having given up the fort. Rumors of peace, again, were rampant at the time. Ships were coming into the anchorages. Information was being sent as quickly as it could up and down the coast. This battle took place in the second week of February. Again, regular forces against regular forces. Is this the last battle of the war? And this is more on Bower. What the British forces did, they laid the siege lines. Lambert needed a success. He could not go back to England having been part of the debacle that occurred here at New Orleans. So he was looking for success. He wanted a success. He figured out how to do it. His engineers got the job done. The 2nd United States Infantry, that part of it that was at the fort, surrendered on the 12th of February. When is a battle a battle? The Indians were clearly allies of the British. They were encouraged by the British. They were funded by the British. They were armed in some cases by the British, and they were fed by the British. The Western Star was a newspaper published in the Western area, and it describes 4, maybe 5, distinct Indian raiding parties going on between November 1814 and May of 1815. The last one of these in May involved a patrol coming out of Cincinnati that was attacked by Indians on their patrol route. 4 or 5 U.S. regulars were killed. 2 others disappeared. They may have been taken captive, and they may have been later murdered. These were events. Some of the historians like to use the word something like this as being the last scene of the war. But this was going on in May of 1815. Other battles in Missouri, major battles in Missouri. If you know what the Missouri Rangers were, they were regulars that were brought in, acted as rangers. They were paid a little bit differently than the infantry because they provided their horses. But the Missouri Rangers were active all the way up through May of 1815. Several of the major instances that took place at the Luttra River and at the Battle of the Sinkhole. Many historians confuse where Fort Howard was. There is a Fort Howard in what became Wisconsin Territory, but it was only organized and set up in 1816. The Fort Howard that was in Missouri Territory was in fact a settler's home that was essentially blockaded, stockaded, and used as a fort for 1814, 1815, and so forth. But near Fort Howard, a familiar name will surface here, Black Hawk. Black Hawk was indeed the Black Hawk that essentially became the namesake of the Black Hawk War of 1832. The issue here is whether or not the war never ended in Missouri Territory. In fact, the same objectives, same principles, same tactics, same strategy. Maybe the war went on to 1832. But anyhow, that's another issue. There were some treaties in July, but the last major combat in Missouri was on the 24th of May. Very quickly, I'm going to go at sea now and tell you about the battles. Now remember, the British blockaded almost the entire Atlantic coast of the United States, and many of these ships just waited for bad weather so they can break that blockade and get out. These were some of the ships late in 1814 and into 1815 that broke the blockade. Let's see where they went. The U.S. Constitution escaped in December of 1814. They stopped a Russian vehicle who had information about the peace having been declared. The captain, Captain Stewart, said, even if our people signed a treaty, our Congress would never ratify the treaty, and he just kept searching for British vessels. He did take on the Levant and the Cayenne, took them both. One was recaptured, but he returned to New York in May of 1815. Here on 20 February, he is engaged with the British fleet and takes two vessels simultaneously. That's Stuart and the USS Constitution. The president had a little bit more difficult time. It tried to escape out of New York, ran aground, was caught by the British squadron, had a running 4-hour battle with the British squadron, took a lot of casualties, inflicted a lot of casualties, but eventually the president was captured. There was a post-war inquiry about Decatur's conduct during the conflict. Decatur was cleared, and in fact, what you see on that little handout, Decatur was the Commodore that was selected to go after Algiers in 1815, and in fact took the first post-war fleet out of the United States and into the Mediterranean. But it was January of 1814 that the president was captured. This was part of a larger effort. Strangely enough, with so few troops, so few ships, we decided to send a squadron into the East Indies, and the squadron was supposed to include the President, the Hornet, the Peacock, the Tom Bolin, and one of John Jacob Astor's ships called the Macedonian, and all of those were going to ship out into the East Indies and raise havoc on British shipping. I don't know, not true. I have my suspicions as to why they picked the East Indies, but here comes the bulk of the escaped American Navy in November, December, and January, and they are going to go all the way to the Sunda Straits. This takes place between January and June. How do they get the word that the war ends? Okay. This is supposed to work. The first thing that happens, this fellow is James Biddle, and he engages the, did I skip one? I bet I did. This guy is Biddle, and he engages a ship down at Tristan da Cunha in early 1815. He takes that ship probably within 20 minutes. When American ships of equal size went up against the British Navy of equal size, the Americans almost inevitably came out a winner. Very, very few Americans were actually taken at sea, and I know everyone's going to say, well, what about the Chesapeake? The difference on the Chesapeake is that the commander of the Chesapeake was arrogant. The commander of the British ship was diligent. And when the Chesapeake met the British ship off of Boston, it didn't take the British 20 minutes to bring the Chesapeake down. Pay attention to what you're doing, train your crews, execute your plan, and you're going to win. I had an argument with a brain surgeon the other day. He had a PhD. I had an argument with one of them the other day, and I said, look, war is not won by the brave. Wars are won by the diligent. And if you're diligent, you get the job done. If you're brave, you get written about. So the Hornet gets down to the South Atlantic, and the Hornet and the Peacock decide to go off into the Indian Ocean. On the way to the Indian Ocean, they met, a British ship of the line called the HMS Cornwallis. They exchanged gunfire. Is that the last exchange of gunfire exchange in the War of 1812? We'll see. The Peacock, in the meantime, loses contact with the Hornet. The Hornet goes back to the United States. The bowline goes into Argentina, and the Peacock finds itself alone. It goes on into the Sunda Strait, went into the area where Indonesia now is, and starts taking prizes. They take down 3 British ships in the space of 3 weeks. They're living high. They found one ship that had opium. They found another ship that had alcohol. They had found another ship that had gold. They are doing well. They come across the Nautilus, and I can get very, very detailed about the battle between the Peacock and the Nautilus. But let it be said that the Nautilus was half the size of the Peacock. The Peacock was flying British colors. The Nautilus comes out, and he says, oh, when Stars and Stripes goes up, oh, you're American. Do you know the war's over? Bull, says the American commander, Warrington. He says, no, really, the war's over. Somebody fires a cannon. Somebody shoots somebody, and we have the Nautilus surrendering within 5 minutes of the beginning of the battle to the Peacock. And here is the Dutch guy. I want you to imagine in the Sunda Straits, the Dutch guy is rowing himself out, he's rowing himself out to the American ship and saying, hey, the war's really over. It's really, really, really over. And Warrington says, How do you know? Because the war's really over. Warrington says, you're probably right. Because back on St. Paul's Island, guess what he gets? Now, you're not going to believe this. These are stories that you don't read about this. He gets a message in a bottle. Now stop laughing now. He goes on St. Paul's Island, and in all this St. Paul's Island, however big it is, and I've never been there, thank goodness, but he wanders around until he finds a bottle. He opens a bottle, and guess what it says? The war's over. But anyhow, this litigation as to what happened to the Nautilus in 1872, a guy is writing the history of the English Indian Navy. And he finds a guy by the name of Boyce, B-O-Y-C-E. Boyce was the captain of the Nautilus, has one leg, okay? Boyce says, I love you Americans. I'm still getting a pension from the United States Congress for the loss of my leg in 1815. U.S. soldiers are not getting pensions in the 1870s. But this guy is getting a pension because British agents of the Indian Navy brought suit in the 1820s against the United States Navy, against Warrington, and against the owners of the Tombeau line for the damages to the British Navy in the Sunda Straits, and they won because the decision was this battle, June 30th, 1815, was beyond the 180-day limit set by the Treaty of Ghent as to when the war was over. Is this battle the last battle of the War of 1812? It didn't hurt Warrington, by the way. Warrington ended up being the acting Secretary of the Navy, retired as an admiral, and lived well into the 1860s. So Warrington did well. Okay. I bet you thought I was going to tell you what the last battle of the War of 1812 was. I bet you thought I was going to tell you. Here are the candidates. If in fact you believe that battles are between regular forces, certainly Fort Bower would seem to be the last battle. If you believe it had to do with militia forces, and if I call the militia into federal service, they are federal troops. If you believe that, apparently the Battle of the Sinkhole is the last battle. If you are joint in your operations and you include naval forces, you may pick the battle between the Hornet and the Penguin was March 23rd. The battle that was ultimately determined to be not in the War of 1812 was Peacock versus Nautilus, and that was June 30th. So someplace between March 23rd and June 30th, the war seemed to have ended. And I ask you now, if anyone in the audience knows what the last battle of the War of 1812 was. I've written a monograph on this, and I've given it to Dr. Manning. He's going to have it at the library. Thank you very much.